Don't start the car. He's in there. The boy's scream cut through the evening business rhythm like a blade, turning the skyscraper parking lot into a scene where every decision could become a death sentence. Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter & Company Holdings, had just finished his board meeting, sliding into his black sedan with the familiar ritual. Tie loosened, phone buzzing with 17 missed calls from his wife, briefcase settled on the passenger seat like an old companion. Another Tuesday ending, like all the others in downtown Chicago's financial district, where glass towers reflected the setting sun in cold geometric patterns that reminded him of cemetery headstones. The October air carried that peculiar Chicago bite that promised snow before Thanksgiving. Daniel's fingers found the leather steering wheel, still warm from the afternoon sun that had baked the car's interior to an uncomfortable 90 degrees. He'd spent the last 3 hours in Conference Room A, listening to quarterly projections and budget allocations, his mind wandering to the dinner reservation at Gibson's that Jennifer had made for their 15th wedding anniversary. Lobster and champagne, probably the same conversation about the kids' college funds and whether they should buy the house in Aspen. But before he could turn the key, that small voice again. Please don't leave. He's in the trunk. Daniel's world fractured for a heartbeat. His coffee-stained fingers froze on the ignition. The child stood 20 feet away, in a torn Bears jacket that had seen too many winters, his breath visible in the October air like small ghosts escaping his lungs. Luis Rivera, 8 years old, son of Maria, the night cleaner, who worked the 42nd floor. Every evening, Luis waited by the loading dock while his mother emptied waste paper baskets and scrubbed conference room tables, watching cars and people in this zone where money moved like blood through arteries. The boy had become as much a fixture as the security cameras and the bronze sculpture of some forgotten industrialist that dominated the building's entrance plaza. Daniel had noticed him before. How could you not? A small black boy with intelligent eyes, always carrying a backpack stuffed with library books, sometimes doing homework under the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading dock. Maria brought him to work because daycare cost more than she made in a week, and the after-school program at Lewis's elementary school had been cut when the district budget fell apart. Tonight, something was different. Lewis wasn't reading or playing games on his mother's ancient flip phone. He stood rigid, his small fists clenched, his face pale despite his dark skin. Daniel didn't brush him off. He could have. God knows most executives would have. But something in the boy's eyes, fear mixed with desperate determination, made him pause. The memory of his own son Andrew at that age, before boarding school and summer camps, had taught him that emotions were weaknesses to be managed rather than felt. He cut the engine and stepped out, his Italian leather shoes clicking against asphalt, still warm from the day's heat. Around them, the usual evening exodus continued. Executives hurrying to dinner reservations at Shaw's Crab House and Alinea, security guards changing shifts, the distant hum of traffic on Lakeshore Drive mixing with the occasional siren. A homeless veteran Daniel recognized from his daily walk rattled change in a cup near the Starbucks entrance, ignored by everyone except Lewis, who sometimes shared his sandwich. Daniel walked toward the boy, noticing details that his rush to leave had previously obscured. Lewis's sneakers had holes in both toes, held together with duct tape that had been applied with careful precision. His jeans were clean but faded, the kind of careful pour that spoke of a mother who took pride in presentation despite having nothing to work with. He knelt down to Lewis's eye level, something he hadn't done with a child in years. His knees protested against the asphalt, reminding him of his age, his distance from the world where children mattered more than quarterly earnings. "What did you see, Lewis?" The boy's voice shook but held steady, like a bridge in high wind that refused to fall. "He dragged Uncle Tommy out and stuffed him in your trunk. Blood on his hands, real blood, not like in movies." Lewis's voice dropped to a whisper. "I was hiding by the dumpster when they came. Mr. Morrison was talking to another man, someone I didn't recognize. White guy in a suit like yours, but cheaper. They were arguing about papers." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Tommy Alvarez had been cleaning Carter & Company offices for 12 years, ever since immigrating from El Salvador, with dreams of bringing his family to America. A quiet man who spoke broken English but understood everything, who always nodded respectfully when Daniel passed him in the hallways, who somehow knew every employee's name despite working the night shift when most people had gone home. "What kind of papers, Lewis?" "Uncle Tommy showed my mom last week. Said they were throwing away stuff that proved the company was hurting people. Barrels by the river, chemicals that made the water smell like rotten eggs. Lewis wiped his nose with his sleeve. He said he was scared, but couldn't stay quiet anymore. Said his little girl in El Salvador needed clean water when she came here, not poison. The atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a storm. 2 security guards materialized from the building's entrance, their radio chatter suddenly urgent. Marcus Webb, the younger guard, had been working the building for only 6 months, still trying to prove himself. The other was Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough corporate crises to know when to keep his mouth shut and collect his pension. A small crowd began forming. Office workers heading to the parking garage, their minds on traffic reports and dinner plans. A food truck vendor named Ahmed closing up his halal cart, the smell of lamb and rice still hanging in the air. Someone with a phone already recording, because in 2024, everything became content, every human crisis potential viral gold. Daniel noticed the recording phone and felt his stomach drop. In an age where careers died in viral moments, where board meetings could be called over trending hashtags, where stock prices fluctuated with Twitter sentiment, the last thing Carter and company needed was footage of their CEO involved in some kind of incident. But Lewis was still talking, his voice rising with urgency. Please, Mr. Carter, Uncle Tommy was bleeding when they put him in there. I think he might die if you don't help. Daniel moved to the back of his BMW, his hand trembling slightly as he found the trunk release. The car was a company perk, leased through Carter and Company's fleet program, detailed every Wednesday by a service that charged more per wash than most people made in a day. Jennifer always teased him about loving the car more than his family. But it wasn't love, it was armor, a shield of German engineering and luxury leather that separated him from the world's messiness. The trunk popped open with a soft mechanical click. Tommy Alvarez lay curled inside like a broken doll, barely conscious, his janitor's uniform soaked with blood from a gash across his forehead that looked like it had come from something heavier than a fist. His breathing was shallow, labored, the kind of breathing Daniel recognized from his father's final weeks in the ICU. In Tommy's clenched fist, a USB drive, small and black, unremarkable except for the desperation with which the injured man gripped it. Jesus Christ! Daniel's voice carried across the parking lot, cutting through traffic noise and the distant sound of a saxophonist playing for tips near the L station. The phone cameras multiplied. Sarah Chen, tech blogger with 800,000 followers, had been grabbing coffee when she heard the commotion. Now she live-streamed from the crowd's edge, her ring light casting harsh shadows as she narrated the scene for her audience. Breaking, Carter & Co. CEO discovers bloodied worker in his trunk. Child witness claims assault by security. The viewer count climbed rapidly. 1,500, 3,000, 8,000 people watching a corporate crisis unfold in real time. Greg Morrison, head of security, pushed through the gathering crowd with 2 guards flanking him. 6'4", ex-military bearing, the kind of man who made problems disappear quietly through methods that never appeared on any official reports. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, his radio crackling with urgent coded messages that sounded like battle commands. Morrison had been with the company for 15 years, hired after a distinguished career in Army intelligence that ended with a discharge Daniel had never bothered to investigate. The man handled everything from industrial espionage to executive protection, from background checks on potential hires to crisis management that kept Carter and Company's reputation spotless. His salary came from a budget line item labeled consulting services, and Daniel had always been content not to ask too many questions about what those services entailed. Mr. Carter, this is clearly a misunderstanding, Morrison said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. Mr. Alvarez has been showing signs of instability lately, paranoid delusions, erratic behavior. Let me handle this situation through appropriate channels. But Lewis stepped forward, his small body trembling, but his voice clear. He tried to take papers from my dad. Uncle Tommy showed them to Mom last week. Dad saw them loading barrels by the river, 3 trucks full of them. Bad stuff that makes the water smell and kills the fish. The crowd pressed closer. Ahmed the food truck vendor translated for his wife in Arabic, Mrs. Patterson from the 37th floor accounting department filmed with shaking hands, already composing the email she'd send to her sister in Atlanta. Two teenagers on skateboards stopped to watch, their phones automatically uploading to TikTok and Instagram, adding soundtrack music that would make the tragedy feel surreal. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Daniel with difficulty. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, words slurred by pain and blood loss. Richardson, financial reports, toxic waste contracts. They killed my supervisor in Guatemala for asking questions. Each word seemed to cost him enormous effort. Meridian Contractors, my daughter, she's only 12. Daniel felt the world shift beneath his feet. James Richardson, Chief Financial Officer for 8 years, Harvard MBA, member of the Chicago Athletic Association, golf partner who always let Daniel win by exactly 2 strokes. Best man at Daniel's wedding, who'd given a toast about integrity and friendship that had made the bridesmaids cry. Richardson had joined Carter & Company during the recession, when the company was struggling to compete with overseas manufacturers. He'd engineered a series of cost-cutting measures that had saved millions, renegotiating waste disposal contracts, streamlining environmental compliance procedures, finding efficiency opportunities in their international operations. The board had rewarded him with bonuses and stock options, and Daniel had been grateful for a CFO who could navigate the murky waters of global business without bothering the CEO with unnecessary details. But Lewis wasn't finished. The boy's voice rose above the crowd noise, clear and cutting. He said the man in the suit offered him money to keep quiet, lots of money, enough to bring his family here. But Uncle Tommy said his daughter needs clean water, not dirty money. Morrison's radio crackled urgently. A voice Daniel didn't recognize said, Code 7 in the parking structure. Repeat, Code 7. Media presence confirmed. The security chief's face remained impassive, but Daniel caught the quick glance he exchanged with Rodriguez, the older guard. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind of wordless understanding that comes from years of handling situations that never make it into official reports. Mr. Carter, Morrison said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. I strongly recommend we move Mr. Alvarez to the company medical facility immediately. Dr. Patterson can evaluate his condition properly, away from external influences. Dr. Patterson, company physician who'd been treating executive stress and writing carefully worded fitness for duty reports for 20 years. The same doctor who'd diagnosed Tommy's predecessor with chronic fatigue syndrome after the man started asking questions about chemical storage procedures. The same doctor who'd somehow never noticed the cancer cluster among employees who worked near the loading dock where Tommy had seen the barrels. Daniel looked down at Tommy, whose grip on the USB drive had loosened slightly. A drop of blood from the man's head wound had stained the device, making it look like evidence from a crime scene. Which, Daniel realized with growing horror, it probably was. Call 911, Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority that came from 15 years of running board meetings and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Morrison's hand moved to his radio. Mr. Carter, I don't think. Call 911 now. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, preceded by 2 Chicago PD patrol cars, whose officers looked like they'd rather be handling domestic disputes or traffic violations than whatever corporate mess they'd been dragged into. Paramedic Janet Williams, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything from heart attacks in the Mercantile Exchange to overdoses in Millennium Park, knelt beside Tommy with professional efficiency. Possible skull fracture, she called to her partner. Significant blood loss. Blood pressure's dropping. She looked up at Daniel. How long has he been unconscious? Daniel realized he didn't know. How long had Tommy been trapped in his trunk while he'd sat in conference room A discussing profit margins and market penetration? How many minutes had passed while he'd debated whether to stop at Whole Foods for the organic salmon Jennifer liked? We're not sure, Morrison interjected smoothly. Mr. Alvarez collapsed near the parking garage. We were attempting to provide assistance when... That's not what happened, Lewis said, his voice cutting through Morrison's explanation like a knife through silk. I saw him drag Uncle Tommy. I saw the blood on his hands. The paramedics loaded Tommy onto a stretcher, the USB drive still clutched in his hand. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, Detective Ray Kowalski approached Daniel, his notebook already out. Kowalski had been working corporate crimes for 12 years, long enough to recognize the difference between workplace accidents and something more sinister. Mr. Carter, I'm going to need to speak with you and the boy separately. And I'll need to examine your vehicle as potential evidence. Evidence. The word hung in the air, like smoke from Morrison's cigarette, which the security chief had lit despite the no-smoking policy that applied to everyone except senior management. Daniel's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Jennifer. Seeing news reports. Call me now. Then another from his assistant. Board emergency meeting called for tomorrow 7 a.m. And another from his lawyer. Don't say anything to anyone without me present. The machine was already in motion, the same corporate crisis management system that had handled previous problems with quiet efficiency. Lawyers would be called, statements would be prepared, narratives would be constructed. The incident would be framed as a tragic misunderstanding. Tommy would be portrayed as a troubled employee with a history of mental health issues, and Lewis would be dismissed as a confused child who'd misinterpreted what he'd seen. But something had changed in Daniel. Maybe it was Tommy's blood on his hands, or Lewis's unwavering courage, or the way the crowd had started filming everything, making cover-ups impossible in the age of instant media. Maybe it was just the recognition that he'd spent 15 years building a company he didn't really understand, making money from processes he'd never examined too closely. Detective, Daniel said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. I want to cooperate fully with your investigation, and I want to see what's on that USB drive. Morrison stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. Mr. Carter, I strongly advise against. Greg, you're suspended pending investigation. The words came out before Daniel fully realized he'd decided to say them. Morrison's face showed no emotion, but his hand moved instinctively toward his radio, then stopped. Around them, the crowd stirred with the energy that comes when people sense that something historic is happening, when the normal order of things starts to crack. Sarah Chen's livestream viewer count had jumped to 25,000. Her commentary flowed in real time. Corporate security chief just suspended by his own CEO. Child witness claims assault. This is unprecedented transparency from Carter and Company. The hashtags began forming immediately. # corporate cover-up, # whistleblower protection, # justice for Tommy. The video clips spread across platforms faster than PR teams could respond, edited and remixed, and shared with commentary that ranged from outraged to sardonic to conspiracy-minded. But the real story was just beginning. By morning, an anonymous email had landed in newsrooms across the city, sent from an encrypted account that would never be traced. The subject line read, Carter and Company, Environmental Crimes, Evidence Attached. The email contained financial documents, environmental reports, and a detailed timeline of toxic waste disposal that painted a picture of systematic corporate malfeasance spanning 5 years. Tommy Alvarez wasn't just a witness. He was a whistleblower who'd been documenting illegal toxic waste disposal by Meridian Contractors, a company with deep ties to Carter and Company's board of directors. The barrels Lewis had seen contained chemical byproducts from the company's manufacturing plants, dumped illegally in the Chicago River to save millions in proper disposal costs. The documents revealed a web of corruption that reached from the loading docks to the boardroom. Environmental inspectors had been bribed, safety reports had been falsified. Workers who asked questions had been transferred, demoted, or simply disappeared from the payroll. The cancer cluster in the South Side neighborhood where Lewis lived wasn't a coincidence. It was the direct result of contaminated groundwater that had been poisoned by years of illegal dumping. Richardson moved fast. Within hours of the anonymous leak, a black town car pulled up to the Ida B. Wells housing project where Lewis lived with his mother. The CFO himself stepped out, his silver hair perfect despite the stress, carrying a briefcase that promised solutions to problems that poor people couldn't afford to solve. The housing project was a study in institutional neglect, broken elevators, flickering hallway lights, the smell of mold and desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Richardson's Armani suit looked obscene against the backdrop of government-issued poverty, like a diamond ring on a corpse's finger. Maria Rivera answered the door in her cleaning uniform, still wearing the rubber gloves she used to scrub toilets in the building, where Richardson made more in an hour than she made in a month. Her English was broken, but her understanding was perfect. She knew exactly who this man was and what his presence in her home meant. Mrs. Rivera, Richardson said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to simulate empathy in MBA school. I'm here to discuss your son's future. Louis sat at their kitchen table, a piece of furniture they'd bought second-hand from the Salvation Army, its surface scarred by years of homework and family dinners eaten off paper plates. His math homework spread before him, problems about fractions and percentages that suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the grown-up mathematics of corruption and conscience. Richardson opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, revealing documents that had been prepared by the company's legal team in the hours since the parking lot incident. Scholarship papers for St. Bartholomew's Prep, one of Chicago's most exclusive private schools. Lease agreements for a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, complete with granite countertops and lake views. A cashier's check for $50,000, more money than the Rivera family had seen in their combined lifetimes. "Smart boy like you," Richardson said to Louis, ignoring Maria's protests in rapid Spanish that mixed prayers with curses. "Full scholarship to St. Bartholomew's. Your mother never has to clean another toilet. College fund, graduate school if you want it. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, wherever you want to go." Louis stared at the check, his 8-year-old mind trying to process numbers that seemed to belong to a different universe. $50,000. Enough to fix his mother's car, which broke down twice a month. Enough to buy food that didn't come from the discount grocery store where expired milk was marked down, but still cost more than they could afford. Enough to move away from the housing project, where gunshots sometimes interrupted his homework, and the tap water tasted like metal. But Louis had grown up in the shadow of the chemical plant, had watched smoke rise from illegal burns in the industrial district where Meridian contractors operated. He'd seen dead fish floating in the Chicago River, their silver bellies reflecting the city lights like broken mirrors. He'd smelled the acrid chemical stench that made his little sister cough all night, the same cough that had killed his grandmother before she'd ever seen America. Richardson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "All you have to do is tell people you made a mistake. Kids your age, sometimes they get scared, they see things that aren't really there. Nobody would blame you for being confused." Maria's voice rose in Spanish, her words coming fast and angry. Louis understood enough to know she was telling Richardson to leave, that they didn't want his money, that some things couldn't be bought. But he also heard the tremor in her voice, the note of uncertainty that came from a lifetime of choosing between dignity and survival. "Think about your mother," Richardson continued, his eyes moving to Maria with calculated sympathy. "She works 3 jobs just to keep you fed. Cleaning office buildings, waiting tables at that diner, taking in laundry on weekends. Wouldn't it be nice to give her a rest? Wouldn't you like to see her smile again?" Louis looked at his mother, really looked at her. The premature lines around her eyes, the calluses on her hands from scrubbing floors, the way she sometimes winced when she thought no one was watching, her back aching from years of bending over toilets and mopping floors. When was the last time he'd seen her smile? Really smile, not just the tired version she gave him when she thought he needed encouragement. But he also remembered Uncle Tommy's stories about his daughter in El Salvador, about the village where the water had turned brown and children were being born with defects that the doctors couldn't explain, about the American company that had built a factory upstream and promised jobs and prosperity, but delivered only poison. "No," Louis said simply, his voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that adults spend lifetimes trying to recapture. Richardson's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold, like lake water in January. He closed the briefcase with a sharp snap that echoed in the small apartment like a gunshot. "Think carefully, son. Chicago can be a dangerous place for families who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." The threat hung in the air after Richardson left, as tangible as the smell of his expensive cologne, mixing with the apartment's persistent odor of poverty and industrial cleaning products. Maria deadbolted the door and checked the windows twice before allowing herself to cry, great heaving sobs that she tried to muffle so Louis wouldn't hear. But Louis was already planning. The next morning brought a new escalation. Tommy's car, parked outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where he was recovering from surgery, had its tires slashed during the night. Security footage mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact window when the vandalism occurred. Maria's bank account was frozen due to irregularities that would take weeks to resolve, leaving the family with $17 in cash and a refrigerator full of food they couldn't replace. Louis's elementary school principal, Mrs. Henderson, called Maria in for a conference. Apparently, there had been concerns about Lewis's behavior, reports that he'd been disruptive and telling inappropriate stories to his classmates. Perhaps it would be best if he took some time off while the school investigated these concerning developments. The message was clear. Truth-telling was a luxury that poor families couldn't afford. But Lewis had been watching and learning. While Richardson had been making threats and Morrison had been orchestrating the cover-up, the boy had been talking to people nobody thought mattered. Ahmed from the food truck, who'd seen the Meridian contractors loading barrels in the middle of the night. Mrs. Patterson from accounting, whose husband worked for the EPA and had been asking questions about Carter and Company's waste disposal permits. Rodriguez, the security guard, whose conscience had been troubling him ever since his grandson developed asthma that the doctors couldn't explain. Lewis understood something that the adults had forgotten. Truth didn't depend on money or power or connections. It just needed people brave enough to speak it. Daniel faced his own pressure campaign, more sophisticated, but no less ruthless. Board members cornered him in the executive washroom, their voices low and urgent, as they stood beside Italian marble sinks that cost more than most people's cars. "Think about the company, Daniel," said Harold Whitman, chairman of the board and heir to a railroad fortune that had been built on the backs of Irish immigrants who died by the hundreds. 30,000 employees depend on us. You really want to destroy all that over some janitor's fantasy? Board member Patricia Henley, whose pharmaceutical company had been quietly settling lawsuits over contaminated pain medications, dabbed at her eyes with tissues that cost more per box than Maria Rivera made in a day. What about the shareholders, Daniel? The pension funds, the retirement accounts? Ordinary people who trusted us with their life savings. His wife Jennifer confronted him at breakfast in their Lake Forest mansion, her manicured fingers trembling around her coffee cup. Ethiopian single-origin beans that cost $60 a pound, served in china that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. Their kitchen was bigger than Luis Rivera's entire apartment, with appliances that used more electricity in a day than some families used in a month. "Please, honey," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the strain of a woman who'd built her identity around her husband's success. "Our reputation, the kids' schools, our friends at the country club. Andrew's already getting questions at Exeter. The other parents are asking if he's the son of that CEO from the news." Their daughter Sarah, home from Northwestern for fall break, had been fielding social media attacks from classmates who'd seen the viral videos. Their son Andrew, captain of the lacrosse team at prep school, had been benched pending review of family circumstances by the athletic department. The smart play was obvious, scripted by decades of corporate crisis management. Richardson had prepared a comprehensive narrative with the help of Kroll Associates, a crisis management firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation for companies caught in ethical scandals. Tommy Alvarez would be portrayed as mentally unstable, possibly drug-addicted, a man whose paranoid delusions had led him to assault a security guard and injure himself in a psychotic break. Medical records would be produced, showing a history of depression and anxiety. Witnesses would come forward, carefully coached witnesses who'd testify to his erratic behavior and increasingly disturbing statements about imaginary conspiracies. Lewis would be described as a traumatized child, confused by what he'd witnessed, his memories distorted by the shock of seeing a bloody adult. Child psychology experts would explain how young minds could create false narratives when exposed to violence. The boy's testimony would be dismissed as the unreliable recollections of a frightened 8-year-old who'd watched too many crime shows. The environmental evidence would be explained away as clerical errors and bureaucratic misunderstandings. Meridian contractors had been properly licensed and inspected. The chemical readings that showed contamination would be attributed to naturally occurring minerals in the Chicago River. The cancer cluster would be linked to pre-existing industrial pollution from decades past, not Carter and Company's recent operations. Problem solved, reputation intact, stock price stabilized, business as usual. Richardson had already begun implementing the plan. Friendly journalists received carefully leaked information about Tommy's mental health history. Social media influencers were paid to promote alternative theories about what had really happened in the parking lot. Legal teams prepared defamation suits against anyone who repeated the false accusations against Carter and Company. The machine was in motion, oiled by decades of practice and millions of dollars in legal fees. It had worked before, covering up industrial accidents, burying environmental reports, silencing whistleblowers through a combination of bribes, threats, and legal intimidation. But Richardson had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd underestimated the power of an 8-year-old boy who'd been raised to believe that truth mattered more than comfort. Luis Rivera had spent his entire life in environments where lying was a survival skill. You lied to the welfare office about your mother's second job so you wouldn't lose benefits. You lied to the school nurse about why you didn't eat lunch so they wouldn't call social services. You lied to your friends about having nice things so they wouldn't know how poor you really were. But Uncle Tommy had taught him something different. In the quiet hours of the loading dock, while Maria cleaned offices upstairs, Tommy had told Louis stories about his home in El Salvador, about villages where the water ran clear and children played in rivers that didn't smell like death, about American companies that came with promises of progress but left only poison behind. Mijo, Tommy had said in his careful English, mixing Spanish words that Louis understood better than the adults realized. Sometimes telling the truth is the most dangerous thing you can do. But staying quiet when people are dying? That's more dangerous for your soul. So Louis made his choice. Instead of retreating into silence, he began talking to everyone who would listen. He called the Tribune reporter who'd covered the story, giving her details that hadn't made it into the initial reports. He spoke to environmental activists who'd been investigating industrial pollution in South Side communities. He contacted the EPA whistleblower hotline, his 8-year-old voice carefully reciting facts he'd memorized about barrel locations and dumping schedules. Most importantly, he reached out to other families in his neighborhood, connecting dots that adults had been too busy or too scared to connect themselves. Mrs. Washington's son with leukemia, Mr. Rodriguez's daughter born with lung defects, the Henderson family dog that had died after drinking from a puddle that never seemed to dry up, no matter how little rain fell. The cancer cluster wasn't just statistics in a medical journal. It was Louis's community, his friends, his neighbors. People who mattered, even if they didn't have stock portfolios or country club memberships. Daniel watched the counter-narrative unfold from his corner office on the 45th floor, with its panoramic view of Lake Michigan and the city skyline. His assistant brought him updates every hour, media requests, legal briefings, stock price fluctuations, board member concerns. The walls of his office were covered with awards and photographs, handshakes with politicians, ribbon cuttings, charity gala appearances. Evidence of a successful career built on numbers that had seemed important until they were measured against an 8-year-old's courage. He thought about Andrew and Sarah, his own children, raised in privilege and comfort that had insulated them from any real consequences. When was the last time either of them had shown the kind of moral courage that Louis displayed every day simply by continuing to tell the truth? The pressure mounted from every direction. Richardson scheduled private meetings with major clients, assuring them that the situation would be resolved quietly and quickly. The board prepared for Daniel's resignation, already discussing potential replacements who would be more collaborative in their approach to crisis management. Jennifer made her own preparations, consulting with divorce attorneys who specialized in high-asset cases. She'd stood by her husband through business scandals before, but this was different, messier, more public, more dangerous to the carefully constructed life she'd spent 20 years building. But Louis kept talking, and more importantly, people kept listening. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez, the veteran security guard, finally decided that 30 years of silence had been enough. He contacted Detective Kowalski with evidence he'd been collecting for months. Photographs of the midnight dumping operations, recordings of conversations between Morrison and Meridian contractors, financial records showing payments for special services that bore no resemblance to legitimate security work. Rodriguez had 2 granddaughters living in the housing project where Louis lived. One had asthma so severe that she'd been hospitalized 3 times in the past year. The other had been born with developmental delays that doctors couldn't fully explain. When Rodriguez saw Louis's courage in speaking truth to power, he realized that his silence had been enabling the poisoning of his own family. The evidence Rodriguez provided corroborated everything Louis had witnessed and more. The illegal dumping wasn't a recent development. It had been going on for years, systematically contaminating groundwater that supplied drinking water to low-income neighborhoods. The cancer cluster was just the visible tip of an environmental catastrophe that would continue claiming victims for decades to come. Tommy Alvarez's USB drive contained the financial documentation that tied everything together: invoices for waste disposal services that were never actually provided, environmental reports that had been falsified to hide contamination levels, and email chains between Richardson and Meridian executives discussing the final solution to their waste disposal costs. The final solution had been human beings. Specifically, poor human beings whose lives were considered acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of quarterly profit targets. Daniel sat in his office as the sun set over Lake Michigan, watching the light fade from a sky that would have been beautiful if he hadn't known what was hidden beneath the surface of the water. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from lawyers, board members, and crisis management specialists, all offering versions of the same advice: cut ties with everyone involved, claim ignorance of operational details, and wait for the news cycle to move on to the next scandal. But every time he started to reach for the phone to authorize the cover-up, he thought about Luis Rivera standing in a parking lot, risking everything to save the life of a man he called Uncle Tommy, an 8-year-old boy who understood something about integrity that Harvard Business School had never taught. Daniel had spent his career making decisions based on risk-benefit analyses, cost-benefit calculations, and shareholder value maximization. Every choice was filtered through spreadsheets and focus groups and market research. But Lewis had made his decision based on something simpler and more fundamental: the belief that truth mattered more than consequences. That evening, Daniel drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital to visit Tommy Alvarez. The man was awake, his head wrapped in bandages, his eyes still showing the effects of the concussion Morrison had given him with a lead pipe in the parking garage. "Mr. Carter," Tommy said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed just hours before. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I know this is bad for business." Daniel pulled a chair beside the hospital bed, noting the armed security guard outside the room, protection against whoever had tried to silence Tommy permanently. "You don't have anything to apologize for, Tommy. I'm the one who should be sorry." "My daughter," Tommy whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "She's 12 years old, still in El Salvador with her grandmother. I've been saving money to bring her here for 3 years. But when I saw those reports, when I realized what the chemicals were doing to the children here, how could I bring her to this?" Daniel thought about his own children, about the private schools and summer camps and college funds that insulated them from the kind of choices Tommy faced every day. When Sarah had wanted to study environmental science at Northwestern, Daniel had encouraged her because it seemed like a safe, prestigious field. When Andrew had expressed interest in social justice during his idealistic phase, Daniel had smiled indulgently and assumed it would pass. But Tommy's daughter would grow up in a world where environmental science was a matter of life and death, where social justice wasn't a phase, but a survival skill. "What do you want me to do, Tommy?" The injured man reached under his pillow and pulled out a photograph: a young girl with pigtails and a school uniform, smiling beside a fountain in what looked like a village square. "Her name is Isabella. She wants to be a doctor, to help sick children. But in our village, children are sick because American companies poison the water. Here in Chicago, children are sick because American companies poison the water. Same poison, different country." Tommy's eyes met Daniel's, and in them, the CEO saw a reflection of his own moral bankruptcy. "I want my daughter to come to an America that's better than the one that destroyed her village. I want Luis Rivera to grow up in a world where 8-year-old boys don't have to choose between safety and truth." Daniel left the hospital with Tommy's photograph in his pocket and a decision crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on lakes. Michigan. He drove through neighborhoods he'd never visited, despite living in Chicago for 20 years, past housing projects where families like the Riveras struggled to survive in the shadow of the prosperity he'd helped create. The irony wasn't lost on him. Carter and Company had spent millions on corporate social responsibility programs, funding scholarships and community centers and environmental initiatives that looked impressive in annual reports. Meanwhile, their actual operations had been systematically poisoning the same communities they claimed to serve. He pulled into the parking lot of Luis Rivera's elementary school, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated children. Broken playground equipment, windows patched with cardboard, a parking lot full of potholes that would swallow a BMW tire. This was where the boy who'd saved Tommy Alvarez came to learn about fractions and spelling words, in classrooms that smelled like industrial disinfectant and desperation. Daniel's phone rang. Richardson. Danny, where are you? The board meeting moved up to 8 p.m. We need to present a united front. I've got everything arranged. Legal strategy, media response, transition plan. By tomorrow morning, this whole thing will be just another news cycle. What about the families, James? The cancer cluster? The contaminated water? Richardson's laugh was cold, practiced. Danny, you're thinking like an engineer again instead of a businessman. We're not responsible for every environmental problem in Chicago. Correlation isn't causation. These communities had health issues long before Carter and Company existed. And the barrels? The illegal dumping. Alleged illegal dumping, alleged by a mentally unstable janitor and a traumatized child. Our lawyers have already found 3 expert witnesses who'll testify that proper procedures were followed at all times. Daniel hung up without saying goodbye. At 7:30 that evening, Daniel Carter walked into the boardroom on the 52nd floor of the Carter and Company building, where men and women in $1,000 suits had gathered to decide how to make a cancer cluster disappear from the quarterly reports. The boardroom was a monument to corporate power. Mahogany table that had cost more than most people made in a year, leather chairs that had been handcrafted in Italy, windows that offered a view of the city that made the human beings below look like insects. Richardson stood at the head of the table, his presentation materials spread out like battle plans, charts showing media response timelines, graphs projecting stock price recovery scenarios, legal briefs outlining defamation strategies against anyone who repeated the false allegations. Gentlemen, ladies, Richardson began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd made inconvenient truths disappear before. We're dealing with a textbook crisis management scenario. Emotional hysteria amplified by social media, exploited by opportunistic lawyers and environmental extremists. Board member Patricia Henley nodded approvingly. The important thing is to control the narrative before it spirals out of control. We've seen what happens when companies let these situations drag on. Look at what happened to Purdue Pharma. Harold Whitman, the railroad heir, adjusted his gold watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Luis Rivera's family would see in 5 years. The shareholders are getting nervous. Stock price is down 12% since yesterday. We need decisive action. Richardson clicked to his next slide. Character assassination strategy, Tommy Alvarez. The bullet points were brutal in their efficiency. Mental health records, immigration status questions, suggestions of drug use, implications of financial desperation that might drive false accusations. We've already planted stories with friendly journalists, Richardson continued. By Friday, the narrative will be clear. Unstable employee makes wild accusations after workplace accident. Traumatized child provides unreliable testimony. Opportunistic lawyers exploit tragedy for financial gain. The next slide, Luis Rivera. Psychological profile. Daniel felt sick reading the bullet points that reduced an 8-year-old boy's courage to psychological pathology. Attention-seeking behavior, history of disruptive incidents at school, possible coaching by anti-corporate activists. Daniel thought about Luis doing homework under fluorescent lights in a loading dock, about the boy's careful explanation of what he'd witnessed, about the courage it had taken to speak truth to power, when power had every reason to crush him. Richardson was moving to his next slide when Daniel spoke. Stop. The room fell silent. Richardson's laser pointer paused mid-gesture. I said stop. Daniel stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Tommy Alvarez's photograph. Isabella, pigtails and school uniform, smiling beside a fountain in a village where the water had turned brown. Her name is Isabella Alvarez, Daniel said, his voice carrying across the boardroom like a confession. She's 12 years old. She wants to be a doctor. Her father nearly died trying to prevent us from poisoning her future home, the same way American companies poisoned her birthplace. Board members shifted uncomfortably. Richardson's face showed the first crack in his composure. Daniel, you're clearly under enormous stress, Whitman began. Tommy Alvarez has been documenting our crimes for months, not allegations, crimes. We've been paying Meridian contractors to illegally dump toxic waste into the Chicago River. We've falsified environmental reports. We've bribed inspectors. We've systematically poisoned low-income communities because their lives are cheaper than proper waste disposal. Patricia Henley's voice rose. Daniel, you need to stop talking immediately. Everything you say in this room is being recorded. Good, let it be recorded. Daniel walked to the window, looking down at the city lights that hid so much suffering. Somewhere down there, Luis Rivera was probably doing homework at a kitchen table in a housing project, breathing air contaminated by Carter & Co.'s efficiency measures. Somewhere down there, Tommy Alvarez's daughter was waiting for her father to bring her to America, not knowing that America had already come to her village in the form of chemical barrels dumped in rivers. 8 years old, Daniel said, still looking out the window. Luis Rivera is 8 years old, and he has more integrity than everyone in this room combined. Richardson stood up, his voice sharp with authority. Daniel, sit down. You're having some kind of breakdown. We'll get you help, medical leave, whatever you need. But you cannot continue. Daniel turned back to face the board, and they saw something in his eyes that made them understand that the careful corporate choreography they'd planned was about to collapse. I'm calling a press conference tomorrow morning. I'm releasing every document on Tommy's USB drive. I'm inviting federal investigators to audit every environmental report we've filed for the past 5 years. And I'm establishing a $100 million fund to provide medical care for families affected by our contamination. The room erupted in voices, board members talking over each other in desperate attempts to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond their ability to manage. The shareholders will sue us into bankruptcy. You'll destroy 30,000 jobs. Think about your family, your reputation. We can have you, declared mentally incompetent. Daniel waited for the noise to die down, then spoke quietly, his words cutting through their panic like a blade through silk. Luis Rivera knew exactly what would happen to him when he decided to tell the truth. An 8-year-old boy understood that some things matter more than personal consequences. Are you telling me that grown adults with Harvard MBAs can't understand something that an 8-year-old figured out? Richardson's voice was deadly quiet. Daniel, if you do this, you'll destroy everything we've built, everything your father built. This company has been your family's legacy for 3 generations. My father built Carter & Company to create jobs and prosperity. We turned it into a machine for poisoning children. That's not a legacy. That's a crime against legacy. Daniel walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. The board can vote to remove me if they want, but the press conference happens tomorrow morning regardless. Tommy Alvarez almost died trying to protect Isabella and Luis and all the other children we've been poisoning. The least I can do is make sure his sacrifice means something. He left the boardroom to the sound of Richardson shouting orders to lawyers and crisis management specialists, their voices echoing off mahogany and marble like prayers in an empty cathedral. That night, Daniel sat in his home office in Lake Forest, drafting the speech that would end his career and possibly save his soul. Through his window, Lake Michigan stretched toward the horizon, its surface reflecting starlight that made it look clean and pure. But Daniel knew better now. He knew what lay beneath the surface, what poisons his company had been feeding into the water that families like the Riveras depended on for survival. Jennifer found him there at 3 a.m, still writing by lamplight. The lawyers called, she said, her voice hollow. They're saying you've had a nervous breakdown, that the stress of the situation has made you temporarily incompetent. They can have you committed for psychiatric evaluation, keep you away from reporters for weeks. Daniel looked up at his wife of 20 years, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. The woman who'd chosen him for his ambition and his earning potential, who'd built her identity around his success, who'd never asked too many questions about how the money was made as long as it kept flowing. What do you think I should do, Jen? She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the lake. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I think about Sarah and Andrew, about the world we're leaving them, about whether I want them to be proud of us or ashamed. And I think an 8-year-old boy just taught us something about courage that we never learned in all our years of success. Jennifer kissed his forehead, then walked back upstairs to pack. By morning, she would be gone, taking the children to stay with her sister in California while the media storm raged. But before she left, she placed a check on his desk, her own money, inherited from her grandmother's estate, made out to the Luis Rivera Education Fund. For the scholarship, she said simply. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Daniel Carter stood behind a podium in Carter and Company's gleaming lobby, with its marble floors and abstract sculptures that had once seemed like symbols of achievement, but now looked like monuments to moral emptiness. Behind him sat Luis Rivera and his mother, Tommy Alvarez in a wheelchair with his arm in a sling, and 3 FBI agents who'd been quietly building a case for months. The media crush was overwhelming. Local news crews, national correspondents, international reporters who'd flown in to cover what was being called the child whistleblower case. Sarah Chen's live stream had drawn over 1 million viewers. The hashtags were trending globally. Warnerdy truth from the mouths, Warorichi children over profits, Warnerdy justice for Isabella. Daniel looked directly into the cameras, knowing that his words would be broadcast around the world, that his children would see them, that Tommy's daughter in El Salvador would eventually hear the truth about why her father had been willing to risk his life. Yesterday, a brave 8-year-old boy saved my life, Daniel began, his voice steady, despite the career suicide he was committing. Today, I'm releasing every document on this USB drive to federal investigators. But more importantly, I'm asking for your help in saving the lives of the children my company has been poisoning. The files revealed a web of corruption spanning 5 years and multiple states. Falsified environmental reports in 7 cities. Bribes to 93 local officials. Threats against 47 whistleblowers, 3 of whom had died in accidents that federal investigators would later prove were murders. Richardson had been skimming millions from cleanup budgets while systematically poisoning water supplies across the Midwest. The cancer cluster in Lewis's neighborhood wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that extended from Chicago to Detroit to Cleveland, wherever Carter and Company had found communities too poor to fight back effectively. The scandal exploded across national media with the force of a natural disaster. Congressional hearings were called within hours. The EPA launched criminal investigations. The Justice Department impaneled grand juries in 6 states. Richardson was arrested at his Lake Forest mansion while attempting to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands, his Swiss bank accounts frozen by federal marshals. Morrison disappeared entirely, his body found 3 weeks later in the Chicago River, apparently murdered by Meridian contractors who feared he would testify to save himself. But the real story wasn't in the headlines or the congressional testimony or Richardson's eventual 25-year sentence. The real story was in the quiet transformations that followed Luis Rivera's moment of courage in a parking lot. Carter and Company survived the investigation, barely, after Daniel's cooperation with federal prosecutors and a complete house cleaning that removed every executive who'd known about the illegal dumping. The company's stock price collapsed, then slowly recovered, as new environmental initiatives and transparency measures restored public trust. Daniel resigned as CEO, but remained as chairman of a new environmental oversight board that included Tommy Alvarez and 3 other former whistleblowers. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the same parking lot where it all began, watching Luis Rivera walk toward St. Bartholomew's Prep in a uniform that had been earned through legitimate scholarship programs rather than hush money. The boy was taller now, more confident, but his eyes still held the same moral clarity that had cut through adult corruption like light through darkness. Tommy Alvarez had returned to work, promoted to Director of Environmental Compliance, with a salary that would allow him to bring Isabella to America within the year. The girl had written a letter to Luis, thanking him for helping her father and expressing her hope that America would be the kind of place where children could tell the truth without fear. The cancer cluster in Lewis's neighborhood was being addressed through a $1 billion cleanup fund established with Carter and Company's assets and Richardson's confiscated fortune. It would take decades to fully remediate the contamination, but the poisoning had stopped. Children in housing projects across the Midwest were breathing cleaner air and drinking safer water because an 8-year-old boy had refused to stay silent. Luis had become something of a celebrity, invited to speak at environmental conferences and children's rights rallies. But he remained grounded, still doing homework at kitchen tables, still caring about the kids in his neighborhood who didn't have cameras following them around. "Mr. Carter," Luis said as they walked toward the building's entrance, "my teacher says I want to be like you when I grow up." Daniel smiled, thinking of all the board meetings and profit reports and quarterly projections that had once seemed so important. All the awards and accolades and magazine covers that had meant nothing when measured against an 8-year-old's courage. Louis, I hope I can be more like you. The boy looked confused. What do you mean? Brave enough to speak the truth when it matters. Smart enough to know that some things are more important than being comfortable. Strong enough to do the right thing, even when it costs everything. As they walked through the doors of the building where Carter and Company continued its work, now focused on environmental restoration rather than environmental destruction, Daniel reflected on the strange calculus of courage. How a child with nothing to gain and everything to lose had shown more integrity than men with Harvard MBAs and corner offices. How a split-second decision to listen rather than dismiss had changed not just 2 lives, but the lives of thousands of children across multiple states. Louis paused at the elevator bank, looking up at the digital display that showed stock prices and financial news. Carter and Company's share price was slowly climbing back toward respectability, but it would never again reach the inflated heights that had been built on poisoned water and dead children. Is it hard? Louis asked. Doing the right thing when everyone tells you not to. Daniel thought about Jennifer, who'd filed for divorce but remained his closest advisor in establishing victim compensation funds. About his children, who'd been initially ashamed of their father's fall from grace, but had gradually come to understand that integrity mattered more than social status. About the board members and executives who'd turned their backs on him, and the workers and community activists who'd embraced him. The hardest thing I've ever done, Daniel said honestly, but also the most important. Uncle Tommy says courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared, but doing the right thing anyway. Daniel nodded. Uncle Tommy is a wise man. He says his daughter Isabella is excited to meet you when she comes to America. She wants to thank the CEO who listened to her father. I'm not the CEO anymore, Louis. But you're still the man who chose to listen. That's more important than being CEO. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. As they rode up to the 42nd floor, where Maria Rivera continued her work, now as head of the building's newly established Worker Safety Committee, Daniel marveled at how much had changed since that October evening when a boy's scream had shattered his comfortable assumptions about the world. Louis pulled out his homework, math problems involving percentages and fractions that would have seemed impossible to solve just months ago. But the boy attacked them with the same methodical determination he'd shown in facing down corporate corruption. Some problems had clear solutions if you were willing to do the work. Mr. Carter, Louis said as they reached the 42nd floor, do you think Isabella will like America? Daniel looked out the elevator windows at the Chicago skyline, where construction cranes worked to build new water treatment facilities and environmental monitoring stations, where EPA investigators continued their work of documenting decades of corporate crime, where families like the Riveras were slowly beginning to trust that their government might actually protect them rather than exploit them. I think Isabella will find an America that's trying to live up to its promises, Daniel said. Thanks to you. The elevator doors opened, and Louis Rivera walked out into a world that was imperfect but improving, carrying homework and hope in equal measure. Behind him, Daniel Carter stood in the elevator for a moment longer, thinking about 8-year-old courage and the price of truth and the strange ways that children could save the souls of the adults who were supposed to protect them. Above them, the Chicago skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan, its reflection shimmering in water that ran cleaner now, thanks to a boy who'd refused to stay quiet and a man who'd chosen to listen. The city looked the same from a distance, but underneath its surface, everything had changed. In his pocket, Daniel still carried the photograph of Isabella Alvarez, pigtails and school uniform, smiling beside a fountain that would soon run clean again. Not because of government regulations or corporate initiatives or charitable donations, but because an 8-year-old boy had understood something that Harvard Business School never taught. That truth, however inconvenient, however costly, remained. The only currency worth trading in. Courage, Daniel thought, as the elevator descended toward the lobby, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. The doors opened onto a world where children could speak truth to power and expect to be heard. Where corporate executives could choose conscience over comfort. Where 8-year-old boys could change the course of history simply by refusing to look away when adults preferred blindness. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better. And sometimes, better was enough to build a future worthy of Isabella's dreams and Louis's courage. Outside, the Chicago River reflected the afternoon sun like liquid silver, carrying clean water toward the lake where children could play without fear of poison, where families could drink without calculating the cost to their health, where truth had finally proven stronger than the machinery of corporate denial. In the end, that was Luis Rivera's greatest victory, not just exposing one company's crimes, but proving that in America, at least sometimes, 8-year-old courage could triumph over billion-dollar corruption. The boy who'd screamed, "Don't start the car," had started something much more powerful, a revolution of conscience that would echo through corporate boardrooms and children's playgrounds for generations to come.